means of overcoming the relationship of dependency that it has historically had with North America, and that has involved extensive meddling in Latin American affairs by American governments and so on and so forth. A second problem associated with this prisoner's dilemma aspect of trade negotiations is information. Information, the availability of information. And that in turn has resulted in the creation of institutions for the sharing of that information. On a global scale in particular, the organizations of the World Trade Organization, or the General Agreement of Tariff and Trade, which preceded it, are those kinds of institutions that allow the various participants in a trade agreement to monitor the implementation of their partners. Now, as we pointed out with regard to the prisoner's dilemma back a couple of months ago, the ability of prisoners in such a game to cooperate tends to increase as they go through the experiment more often. Meaning that they first enter into a prisoner's dilemma kind of a game, their dominant strategy is likely to be uncooperative, which ultimately doesn't gain them great benefits. But over time, they start to figure out that perhaps they can trust their partner to a greater extent. And if they trust their partner to a great extent, that means that they expect their partner to cooperate to a greater extent, and that they are themselves willing to cooperate to a greater extent. And the upshot of that is that repeated interactions between states have essentially the same role. They build trust over time, and therefore allow for greater integration to move forward. In that regard, if we go back up to the list of the steps taken in the European Union, certainly the suggestion of a currency union and of a complete integration of European economies, had it been made in 1945, would have gone nowhere. The trust between the various actors simply wasn't there. By 1991, when the Maastricht Treaty was signed, on the other hand, Germany and France had extensive experience in cooperating with one another, as did most of the other members of the European Union, making that step that much easier. It also, of course, meant that in the interim there were extensive bureaucracies built up in Brussels, institutions built up in Brussels, that likewise facilitated a greater degree of trust and a greater degree of oversight of these kinds of agreements. Now, let me talk lastly about the last two issues here. Why protect it all? The theories that I've discussed so far all seem to point to that trade is a no-brainer, that free trade is a no-brainer. That certainly there are going to be some people that are going to be hurt by it, and that for that reason have good reason to be resistant to free trade. But those folks will be outnumbered by those that will benefit from it, and thus can readily be ignored. I think that that's painting the picture in a bit too rosy of a manner. Why do states protect? Why have they protected in the past? The overwhelming answer to that has to do with things that we discussed earlier on, in particular that relate to mercantilist orientations of states in the past. If there was one reason, above all else, why states have resorted to protection, it was in order to stimulate their own economic development. To stimulate their own economic development. Meaning that the only country on the planet that was able to industrialize without resorting to extensive forms of protection was, anyone want to take a guess?
England.
No, not China.
It was England.
England, absolutely. Great Britain. I would say China not so much. China certainly has opened itself up significantly in the last 30 years, but it went through a period from 1949 until its economic opening in the 80s, but particularly in the 1990s, of extreme protections. In other words, of being completely cut off from international trade, and did a fair amount of industrializing during that period, and subsequently opened up. Great Britain did, in large part because it was the first to do so. And as the first industrializing power, it competed internationally exclusively with non-industrial producers. And having industrial level production gave them a crucial competitive advantage to other forms of production, particular crafts production, non-industrial production. They could crank out goods cheaper by far than any traditional producer. Cheaper, not better. Traditional crafts producers have always been produced better products than their industrial counterparts. A good illustration of that is that, look at Yo-Yo Ma. Yo-Yo Ma is the most famous cello player in the world. Any company on the planet would die to have Yo-Yo Ma play one of their cellos. They'd give it to him for free. In fact, they pay him thousands of dollars to play one of their instruments. But he doesn't play one of their instruments. He doesn't even own the instrument that he does play. The instrument that he does play is probably worth $3 or $4 million, which is, well, by now probably Yo-Yo Ma could afford that, but certainly not in his earlier days. It's a Stradivarius that was produced in the 14th century in Italy. As much as they've tried very hard scientifically to study the materials, the design, and everything else, they cannot put together a violin or a cello or contrabass of anywhere near the same quality as those traditional craftspeople. But they can do it much cheaper, and that is in many ways crucial. Now, Britain industrialized when there were nothing but traditional producers, and against those they had a very decisive competitive edge. Subsequent industrializers didn't have that edge, and therefore, from the outset, late developers had to, as their first step in industrializing, take the step of protectionism. It's the only way that France could industrialize, is by keeping British goods out. It's the only way that Germany could industrialize. It's the only way that the United States could industrialize, and so on. Each of these countries took the step of protectionism as a means to protect their infant industries. And the basic plan was that once those industries have caught up to a technological level where they can compete internationally, then you can relax those trade barriers and compete on even footing with other producers in the world. Industrialization has never taken place since the original industrialization of Europe or Great Britain without some measures of protectionism. And this in turn is what has driven the industrialization, for example, of Latin America. The industrialization of Latin America took the shape of import substituting industrialization. Throughout the 19th century, Latin America was governed by a free trade regime that was supported by Latin American governments that were all run essentially by the owners of large plantations and mining operations that geared their production exclusively for export to industrialized countries. And they made a good living doing that. And on the basis of making that good living, could import all of the goods that they wanted from international markets, and they wanted access to the best possible goods at the cheapest possible price. And that meant that the only way that Latin American countries could industrialize was essentially by eclipsing the power of those ruling elites. And that eclipse took place first in World War I, when Latin America was artificially cut off from international trade by the fact that the Europeans had gone to war and thus didn't have a demand for many of the goods that were being produced by Latin America, and certainly had converted their own production processes to war production, and therefore couldn't supply the demands of Latin American consumers. And that meant that they had no choice but to start to produce some of these goods themselves. Now, World War I only lasted 4 years, so not much progress was made during that period. But far more progress was made during the period of artificial protection from 1929 until the end of the Second World War. During this period, once again, global trade ground to a halt, and suddenly, out of necessity, Latin American economies had to become self-sufficient. And that meant that they had to start to produce goods themselves that they were previously importing. By 1945, when that period ended, consequently, substantial industries had already begun to build up. But they weren't capable of competing on international markets. And that meant essentially that in order to survive, they had to continue the process of protectionism. And that meant that the only way they could do so is insofar as that those new industrial elites had become more powerful than their traditional landed elite counterparts. And the upshot was that they weren't. And the only way that they could defeat the economic power of those traditional elites was by aligning themselves with labor. And this happened in particular, most notably in Perón's Argentina. Perón was the Minister of Labor. He organized all the labor unions throughout Argentina and used that political influence over labor unions to influence the government in favor of protectionism. So protectionism is perfectly reasonable under some circumstances, in particular for economies that come from behind. Now, what is notable about this is that, for the most part, Latin American industrialization has not been particularly successful. It has been successful in supplying domestic demand, but it has never been successful in converting to being able to export those goods into foreign markets. The countries that have been able to do so are those that industrialized on the basis of what has been called export-oriented industrialization. And in particular, the countries that fit that description are the Asian tigers: Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore. All of which, to a substantial extent, industrialized by accessing global markets from the outset. A recent study of the performance of the Asian tigers came to the conclusion that the Asian tigers likewise began with a very brief period of import substituting industrialization, but shifted much more quickly to export promotion. And one reason that they shifted to export promotion is because they could. And the reason that they could is because the United States feared communist expansion in East Asia, and therefore had a powerful interest in the rapid industrialization of states like South Korea. And for that reason, gave South Korea, as well as Japan, open access to the American market, figuring that for the most part they weren't competing with American producers anyway. And that was, to a large extent, the case in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when most of the goods being produced by Japan, South Korea, and so on and so forth, were plastic toys and stuff like that wasn't very profitable to begin with. It was relatively simple. They weren't competing with General Motors or let alone Boeing in production. But essentially, as they progressed, increasingly they became more competitive. And nowadays, Kia and indeed most of the Japanese automakers are giving the American producers a good run for the money. But the reason that they could do so is because of that easy access to the American market. Latin American producers were never given that easy access to the American market. And I would suggest that one reason for that is that the communist threat was never nearly as real in Latin America as it was in East Asia. So that's one good reason to protect. Another good reason to protect is well illustrated by the current situation of Canada and its oil resources, and perhaps more notably by the example of Venezuela. Venezuela, in the 19th century, produced primarily beef, coffee, and cocoa. Coffee was by far their most important export. They also produced some sugar and things along those lines. And produced a great deal of food products for their own domestic market. In 1920, in the region around Maracaibo, they hit their first gusher. And their first gusher essentially was to drill a hole in the ground and out came an enormous plume of oil. Oil, within a very short period of time, became their main export. And becoming their main export meant that their currency value was determined by the productivity of their economy, which was sharply influenced by the productivity of the oil sector and the demand for oil. That meant that the bolivar increased in its value on global markets extensively. And today, the upshot of that is that if you want to get a really, really good cup of coffee, go to a coffee shop in Venezuela. Some of the best coffee I've ever had was in Venezuela. Try buying Venezuelan coffee in North America. I guarantee you won't find it. And the reason is that Venezuelan coffee can't be exported. And the reason is they can't be exported is because not because the Venezuelan government likes its coffee so much that it prevents people from exporting it, but rather because the bolivar is so high in its value as a result of the oil industry that all of the other industries are simply not competitive on international markets. Meaning that coffee from Colombia, coffee from Brazil, coffee from Costa Rica, from Jamaica, from other regions of South America is way, way cheaper than Venezuelan coffee. And that basically meant that one industry mushroomed, dominated the economy, and every other industry simply died out, including subsistence agriculture, or food production for the domestic market. Why produce food on the domestic market when you can import it so much cheaper from elsewhere around the world? That meant that Venezuela, within a very short period of time, became a one-trick pony. And the problem with oil is that it's very capital intensive. And Venezuela is a country in which capital was scarce and labor was relatively plentiful. The fact that it's very capital intensive means that the income from oil goes to very few people. The few people that are employed as laborers and the owners of that operation. And that meant that very quickly, Venezuela became the most egalitarian country in the Western Hemisphere. And that's saying something because Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Central America are all extremely inegalitarian societies. That's the effect of free trade, if unrestricted under those kinds of circumstances. And it's something that Canada has to think about with the expansion of the oil sands. Essentially, the oil sands are likewise having an important impact, although a diminishing impact at the moment, given the low prices of oil globally, that have put a brake on the oil sands development, on the Canadian dollar. The Canadian dollar 50 years ago was worth somewhere around 70 cents to the American dollar. And at that point, its movie industry was thriving, its manufacturing industries were thriving, its tourism industries were thriving, and so on and so forth. Now it's virtually on par, or I think around 90%, 90 cents to the dollar, and that means that it's no longer as attractive of a destination for tourists. It's no longer a very attractive place to make movies. Hollywood North is ramped down rather drastically as a result of that. And increasingly the manufacturing industries can't compete on global markets. They're going to get a boost because the Canadian dollar is once again falling, but we'll have to wait and see how much longer that goes. Let me make one other quick point in regard to that, and that is with regard to the World Trade Organization and NAFTA and free trade in general, and the extent to which a great deal of the opposition to, in particular, NAFTA and the World Trade Organization makes the claim that NAFTA and world trade liberalization generally hurts the poor. Your textbook comes to the conclusion, well, it comes to no conclusion on that question. Essentially, they argue that, yes, it's certainly the case that some people are hurt by free trade, but it's also the case that others benefit from it. And coming to the conclusion of whether those costs and benefits outweigh each other is very difficult to determine. And on the whole, the economic theory seems to suggest that overall everyone ends up being better off. That's not always the case. The impact of NAFTA on Mexico in this regard is in particular instructive. In that NAFTA, the dropping of trade restrictions between North America and Mexico, first and foremost gave American producers of foodstuffs, in particular corn, open access to the Mexican market. Now, at the time, roughly about 2/3 of the population of Mexico were employed in subsistence agriculture, meaning producing things like corn. But they do so on a very small scale, and the price was relatively high on the markets in Mexico. After the signing of the free trade agreement, the Mexican market was flooded with cheap corn from the United States. That in turn drove large numbers of Mexican peasants out of business, and in turn fueled the enormous rise in numbers of economic refugees trying to get into the United States. In that sense, it is certainly clear that the large percentage of that population was indeed damaged by it, was worse off as a result of free trade than they were previous to it. On the other hand, the vast majority of the population of Mexico eats cheaper food today than they did prior to NAFTA. So again, it's not completely evenly distributed. The basic idea was of NAFTA, and this is why I want to end on that, was not simply that it was a free trade agreement, however. In fact, critics of NAFTA argued that very little of NAFTA actually had to do with trade. A lot of it had to do with investment. And investment is something we're going to cover next week and the week after to a greater extent. In other words, a component of NAFTA was that, yes, there would be free trade in materials, but that would also allow North American producers to invest in Mexico and take advantage of cheaper labor costs, and then to import those goods back across the border into the United States. And that has had a phenomenal impact on the North American economy. One will explore in more detail a bit later on. Sorry for taking too long again.